My grandfather's funeral was supposed to be a time of mourning. My older brother and my parents stood beside the solid oak casket looking absolutely devastated. But it was all a flawless performance. My name is Kathleen. I am 28 years old, and as I stood in that freezing red brick church in Richmond, I watched the people sharing my blood drop their masks. My father was not crying. His eyes darted nervously toward the corner of the room tracking my grandfather's lawyer. My mother was silently counting the wealthy corporate shareholders in attendance. Meanwhile, my brother slipped out the side door sweating in the freezing December weather to take a frantic phone call. Then came the moment of silence. As the priest asked everyone to bow their heads, our maid brushed past me. No one ever pays attention to the help. But suddenly she grabbed my hand, squeezing it 3 sharp times. Her voice was a razor-thin whisper against my ear. He did not die of illness. The notebook in the greenhouse. Absolutely do not let them find it. Do not trust them. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up just in time to catch a smirk vanishing from my brother's face as he stepped back into the line. A terrifying web of betrayal was already spinning beneath my feet, and I was the ultimate target. Before I reveal the dark truth my family tried to bury, take a moment to drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from and let me know, have you ever been betrayed by your own blood? Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You will want to hear every detail because sometimes the most dangerous monsters sit at your dinner table. Please note, this story contains dramatized elements for entertainment purposes. Snow fell heavier as the final guest's vehicle disappeared down the sweeping driveway of the brick estate. The oppressive atmosphere inside the house had finally settled into a suffocating silence. The antique clock in the grand hallway struck 2 in the morning. I pulled a heavy, dark wool coat over my shoulders, keeping my footsteps exceptionally light against the hardwood floors. Growing up in this sprawling Richmond mansion meant I knew exactly which oak floorboards groaned under pressure. I carefully bypassed the 3rd step of the grand staircase, melting into the deep shadows of the corridor, and slipped out through the back terrace doors into the biting Virginia winter night. The frost crunched softly beneath my boots as I made my way toward the glass greenhouse standing at the dark edge of the property. Inside, the air was thick with trapped humidity and the sharp, earthy scent of blooming hydrangeas. Esther stood waiting among the towering ferns, her small frame wrapped tightly in a thick woven shawl. The subservient, quiet posture she always maintained inside the main house was entirely gone. Under the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted glass roof, the invisible maid transformed into someone else entirely. Esther looked at me with piercing, steady eyes, revealing a past my family had deliberately ignored. Before spending 2 decades dusting our antique furniture, she had served as a highly trained combat nurse in the military. She understood the human body, physical trauma, and complex pharmacology far better than anyone else in our household. With a voice as sharp as broken glass, she explained how she had noticed the terrifyingly rapid decline in my grandfather's health over his final weeks. She recognized the distinct physical markers of unnatural cardiac distress, the sudden cyanosis around his lips, the specific irregular rhythm of his labored breathing, the abnormal fluid retention. She knew his heart was failing not simply from old age, but from calculated interference. However, my parents had systematically isolated him. They disconnected the landlines in his residential wing, confiscated his personal devices, and placed Esther under constant, threatening surveillance, making it impossible for her to contact the local authorities or a hospital without risking her own life. Without wasting another breath, Esther guided me toward the back corner of the humid greenhouse, pointing a weathered finger to a loose terracotta brick hidden beneath a massive potted hydrangea. I knelt on the damp soil, my fingers going numb from the lingering cold, and pried the heavy stone loose. Buried in the hollowed dirt beneath it was a rusted tin box. My grandfather had always been a deeply meticulous man, trusting physical hiding spots over vulnerable digital security. I pulled the box out and pried the stiff metal lid open. Inside sat 3 items that would completely dismantle my entire reality: a worn leather-bound notebook, a heavy encrypted flash drive, and a generic plastic multivitamin bottle. I turned on a small penlight shielding the narrow beam with the fabric of my coat and opened the leather cover. My grandfather's usually elegant cursive was reduced to a frantic, shaky scrawl. The pages contained detailed transcripts of vicious arguments he had eavesdropped on from behind the heavy oak doors of his own study. Reading the smeared ink, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzed me. Vincent and Phyllis were not merely waiting for nature to take its course. They were actively orchestrating a hostile takeover of my freedom. The journal detailed my father's covert meetings with a highly corrupt local circuit court judge. They were funneling massive bribes to secure a sealed, expedited hearing. Their ultimate goal was to establish a forced conservatorship over me. By hiring 2 compromised medical professionals to provide fabricated psychiatric evaluations, they intended to have me legally declared incompetent and diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia. In the state of Virginia, once a judge grants a full conservatorship, the targeted ward loses all basic civil liberties. My parents would gain absolute legal control over the massive corporate real estate empire my grandfather had left entirely to me in his genuine, unalterable will. They could liquidate the commercial properties, drain the trust funds, and lock me inside a psychiatric facility indefinitely to silence me. My grandfather had figured out their entire blueprint. The final pages of his journal outlined his desperate countermeasure. He had been gathering the necessary financial evidence to legally remove Vincent from the company's board of directors and report the extortion conspiracy to the federal authorities. But the fatal heart attack struck just days before he could file the official paperwork. The terrifying puzzle was almost complete, except for the rattling plastic container resting at the bottom of the tin box. I looked up at Esther, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I held the ordinary multivitamin bottle. Esther reached out and gently tapped the plastic casing. She explained that the local medical examiner had ruled the death a natural acute myocardial infarction because the standard autopsy showed no obvious lethal toxins, only a catastrophic failure of a weakened heart. But the medical examiner had been looking for active poison, not deliberate negligence. Esther whispered the final devastating truth. My grandfather's life-saving daily beta blockers, the precise prescription medication keeping his fragile heart beating, had been meticulously emptied. Someone had refilled his pharmaceutical bottles with identical-looking harmless vitamin supplements. They had not poisoned him. They had systematically deprived him of his medicine, ensuring his heart would tear itself apart naturally, leaving no chemical trace of murder behind. At exactly 9 the following morning, I pushed open the heavy glass door of Marshall's worn-down office in the heart of downtown Richmond. The legal workspace smelled of old parchment and bitter black coffee tucked away on the second floor of a historic brick building near the state capitol. Marshall sat behind a cluttered mahogany desk. He was a formidable man in his late 60s, possessing a razor-sharp legal mind that had successfully defended my grandfather's corporate interests for over 3 decades. Just hours after the medical examiner signed the preliminary death certificate, my father had aggressively terminated Marshall's contract, locking him out of the estate's legal affairs. Now I understood exactly why. I walked across the faded Persian rug and placed the rusted tin box directly onto the center of his desk. Instead of exhibiting shock or confusion at the sight of the smuggled evidence, Marshall simply exhaled a long, heavy breath and adjusted his reading glasses. He did not need to ask where I had found it. He calmly revealed that he had been highly suspicious of the sudden cardiac event for weeks. Knowing my father's deceptive nature, the veteran attorney had silently anticipated foul play and had already cast a wide, invisible net to uncover the truth. Without another word, Marshall pressed a button on his intercom. The inner office door clicked open, and a man stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent room. Marshall introduced him as Gideon, a private investigator specializing in tracing untraceable funds and monitoring the dark financial underbelly of the East Coast. Gideon did not look like a traditional detective. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating demeanor of a corporate auditor. He bypassed any polite introductions, immediately setting a sleek laptop on the desk and turning the screen toward me. The investigator pressed play. Grainy black and white security footage filled the monitor, showing a dimly lit underground casino. I instantly recognized the desperate, sweating man pacing frantically across the screen. It was my older brother. Gideon delivered the crushing reality with zero hesitation. He had been tracking the reckless gambling habits of my sibling for 3 relentless months. The heir to the family name was not just casually losing money at local poker tables. He was drowning in a catastrophic abyss. My brother had managed to rack up a staggering debt of $15 million to a notoriously ruthless Russian organized crime syndicate operating out of the Mid-Atlantic region. Gideon paused the video on a terrifying frame of a heavily tattooed enforcer pressing a massive hand against my brother's chest. The deadline for full repayment was ticking down to mere days. This particular syndicate did not negotiate, and they absolutely did not settle for partial payments. If the massive sum was not wired into their offshore accounts immediately, the entire bloodline would face systematic execution. The suffocating debt was the ultimate catalyst for the unspeakable crimes being committed inside my childhood home. Marshall took over, methodically breaking down the legal framework of their monstrous scheme. He explained the binding terms of the original unalterable will. My grandfather had possessed complete clarity of mind when he drafted the document. He had legally bypassed the destructive generation beneath him, leaving the absolute entirety of the multi-hundred-million-dollar commercial real estate empire solely to me, his only granddaughter. My parents had zero legal authority to liquidate assets, sell properties, or access the massive corporate trust funds. They were entirely locked out of the fortune they desperately needed to save their own lives. Therefore, they had to invent a legal loophole. Marshall outlined the brutal reality of the American probate system. If a targeted individual is deemed medically incompetent by a compromised physician, corrupt family members can petition a corrupt judge for an emergency conservatorship. Once granted, the ward is stripped of all financial autonomy. They intended to legally erase my independence, seize the corporate portfolio on my behalf, and silently sell off the prime real estate to pay the syndicate. Panic surged through my veins, and my immediate instinct was to flee. I told Marshall I needed to drive straight to the airport, board a flight back to my independent life in Chicago, and hire a massive legal team to fight them from a safe distance. Marshall slammed his hand flat against the desk, his voice echoing with stern authority. He warned me that running away was exactly what they wanted. If I fled the state, they would simply present the fabricated psychiatric evaluation to the bribed judge, claiming my sudden disappearance was undeniable proof of a severe mental breakdown. The court would freeze the estate in my absence, granting my father temporary emergency control. By the time I managed to untangle the legal mess from Illinois, the money would be gone, and the company would be destroyed. The only way to dismantle their operation and secure a permanent federal indictment was to provide law enforcement with undeniable proof of active extortion. Marshall looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a chilling instruction. I had to walk straight back into the lion's den. I had to return to the Richmond mansion, play the role of the broken, terrified daughter, and act completely oblivious to their plotting. I needed to serve as the perfect bait, pushing them into a corner until they grew arrogant enough to force a signature under duress. Only then could we spring the trap. The heavy wheels of my suitcase dragged across the marble foyer, the sound echoing harshly against the oak-paneled walls of the estate. I had just informed my family that I was taking an indefinite leave of absence from my architectural firm in Chicago to recover from the shock of losing my grandfather. Instead of the feigned sympathy they had displayed at the funeral, a suffocating hostile tension instantly flooded the room. The psychological warfare began the moment I crossed the threshold. My father wasted absolutely no time. Claiming the sprawling property required heightened security following the tragedy, he immediately hired private contractors to install discreet surveillance cameras along every major corridor and staircase. I was no longer a grieving relative. I was a high-value prisoner inside my own inheritance. There were no clumsy attempts to drug my food or offer me warm milk laced with sedatives. My parents were far more calculating than that. They needed me to break down naturally, or at least appear completely unhinged on a legally admissible recording. The very next morning, my mother invited a stranger into the formal living room. She casually introduced the middle-aged man holding a leather notepad as a grief counselor, a close family friend who simply wanted to check on my emotional well-being. I recognized the predatory glint in his eyes immediately. This was not a friendly visit. It was a hostile psychiatric ambush orchestrated right on our antique velvet sofas. The man began with seemingly innocent questions about my sleep patterns and my grandfather's passing, but his tone quickly shifted into a calculated interrogation. He employed aggressive conversational tactics, deliberately twisting my responses and presenting hypothetical scenarios designed to trigger a manic episode. He pressed heavily on the concept of paranoia, asking if I felt unsafe in my own home, subtly trying to coax me into making wild accusations against my parents without any physical proof. I knew his suit jacket concealed a digital recorder. Any outburst, any raised voice, or any claim of a conspiracy involving mafia debt would be clipped out of context and presented to the corrupt judge as undeniable evidence of severe schizophrenia. I dug my fingernails so deeply into my palms that they bled, forcing myself to maintain absolute, terrifying composure. I answered his invasive questions with flat, emotionless logic, denying him the erratic behavior he was paid to capture. The strategy of passive resistance only pushed my family's desperation to a boiling point. The Russian syndicate did not care about psychiatric evaluations or legal delays. They only cared about their missing money. My brother's physical appearance deteriorated rapidly as the unyielding deadline approached. He stopped sleeping, pacing the upper hallways at all hours, reeking of stale bourbon and cold sweat. The unspoken threat hanging over the mansion finally shattered violently into spoken words during a blinding rainstorm that kept everyone trapped indoors. I had walked into the massive chef's kitchen to pour a glass of water when the heavy wooden door swung shut, locking me inside. Shane stepped out from the shadows near the walk-in pantry. His eyes were completely bloodshot, darting around with the erratic energy of a cornered animal. Without warning, he lunged forward, slamming both of his hands flat onto the marble island, effectively trapping me against the counter. The smell of fear and cheap alcohol radiated off him. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath. He did not bother playing the role of the grieving sibling anymore. He hissed through clenched teeth, abandoning all pretenses of the conservatorship plot. He explicitly laid out the reality of the violence breathing down his neck. He told me that the people he owed money to did not operate within the bounds of the American justice system. They were men who made entire families disappear into the deep swamps of the East Coast without leaving a single forensic trace behind. He demanded that I voluntarily sign over the entire corporate trust, immediately bypassing the lengthy court process. I stared directly into his bloodshot eyes, refusing to flinch or break eye contact. My silence enraged him further. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip tightening like a steel vise, bruising the skin. He leaned his face mere inches from mine and delivered a threat stripped of any familial bond. He asked if I genuinely believed a single isolated woman could survive a war against her own bloodline inside a house they controlled. He promised that if I did not sign the documents by the end of the week, the syndicate's enforcers would not stop at him. They would come for me first, and he would personally leave the front gates wide open for them. The fourth night brought a vicious, unrelenting thunderstorm. Jagged lightning slashed across the Virginia sky, briefly illuminating the quiet, terrifyingly dark corners of the sprawling estate. The oppressive tension of the previous days had manifested into a biting, bitter cold that seeped through the thick window panes, chilling the mahogany corridors of the mansion. To secure a legitimate federal arrest warrant from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Marshall required undeniable physical proof of the financial crimes. He needed the exact bribery payments wired to the corrupt local judge and the digital communications with the syndicate. I knew the physical layout of the mansion's newly installed security grid intimately. The surveillance cameras underwent a mandatory automated network reboot exactly at 3 in the morning, creating a highly vulnerable blind spot that lasted precisely 2 minutes. When the glowing digital clock on my nightstand flipped to the exact hour, I slipped out of my bedroom. Dressed entirely in dark clothing, I hugged the cold plaster walls, utilizing the deafening crashes of thunder to mask the sound of my footsteps. I navigated the labyrinthine hallways, expertly avoiding the creaking floorboards of my youth, ultimately reaching the heavy mahogany doors of my father's private study. Inside, the room smelled intensely of aged cedar and stale cigar smoke. I approached the massive executive desk. My father did not rely on a simple numerical password. His primary desktop was fortified with enterprise-grade two-factor authentication and a robust corporate firewall. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the freezing metal of the encrypted flash drive I had previously recovered from the greenhouse. My grandfather had always been 10 steps ahead of his own son. I inserted the drive into the hidden port beneath the massive monitor. Immediately, a dormant, custom-written executable program initiated. It was a sophisticated decryption tool designed by the elite corporate security experts my grandfather had trusted. A black command window opened, lines of green code racing violently across the screen. I held my breath, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs as the software systematically dismantled the firewall in exactly 60 seconds. The desktop unlocked. I quickly navigated to his hidden mail client and offshore banking ledgers. The screen populated with the ultimate damning evidence, detailed email threads, negotiating the liquidation of corporate assets with the Russian syndicate, and digital receipts, confirming massive wire transfers sent to a shell company owned by the compromised circuit court judge. I initiated the copy command, transferring the entire directory to the flash drive. A progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling at an agonizingly slow pace. 10%, 40%, 70%. When the green bar hit exactly 90%, the sharp click of a light switch echoed through the silent corridor. The harsh crack of yellow light bled beneath the study door. My brother was awake. Shane was not a fool, blinded by exhaustion. His erratic, debt-induced paranoia made him hypervigilant to the slightest disturbance in the house. The heavy brass doorknob turned violently. I had less than 3 seconds to react. I could not pull the drive without irreparably corrupting the data transfer and leaving a massive digital footprint, and there was absolutely nowhere to hide under the minimalist desk or behind the sheer window curtains. I hit the monitor's power button, plunging the screen into darkness. I threw open the heavy French windows, slipped outside into the raging storm, and pulled the glass shut just as the overhead chandelier blazed to life inside the study. I was forced onto the narrow, decorative stone ledge of the second-story balcony. The wrought iron railing was completely encased in a thick layer of slick, treacherous ice. The freezing rain and howling wind whipped fiercely across my face, soaking through my dark clothes instantly. I gripped the frozen metal with bare hands, my boots slipping dangerously against the wet stone. One wrong shift in weight meant a fatal bone-shattering drop onto the brick courtyard below. Through the rain-streaked glass, I watched my brother pacing erratically around the room. He slammed his hands onto the desk, aggressively shifting papers, his bloodshot eyes scanning the deep shadows of the office. He paused right in front of the computer, staring at the blank monitor. I stopped breathing entirely. My 10 fingers grew completely numb, the agonizing ache of the extreme cold radiating up my arms and seizing my chest. My muscles screamed in protest, teetering on the absolute edge of physical failure. The sharp ice sliced into my palms. I pressed my wet face against the freezing brick wall, praying the chaotic darkness of the storm would conceal my trembling silhouette from his line of sight. 5 excruciating minutes dragged on like a grueling, endless century. Finally, Shane cursed loudly into the empty room, flipped the light switch off, and slammed the heavy door shut behind him. His erratic footsteps faded down the hall. Shaking violently from the rapid onset of hypothermia and a massive surge of adrenaline, I forced the window open and collapsed onto the carpeted floor. I crawled desperately toward the desk, gasping for warm air. I turned the monitor back on. The glowing progress bar displayed complete. I yanked the encrypted drive from the port, wiped the keyboard with my wet sleeve to erase any physical trace, and immediately forwarded the compressed encrypted data package directly to Marshall's secure server via my phone. The oak-paneled boardroom on the top floor of the corporate headquarters reeked of stale cigar smoke and profound deceit by 9 o'clock Friday morning. I walked into the massive room, my muscles still aching intensely from the freezing exposure of the previous night. My entire family was already seated around the polished mahogany table, presenting a united, impenetrable front. Beside my father sat the corrupted private psychiatrist from the living room ambush, flanked by a sleazy, high-priced defense attorney I had never seen before. The atmosphere had drastically shifted from subtle psychological manipulation to overt, aggressive hostility. My father did not bother offering me a seat or pretending to care about my emotional state. He immediately slid a thick stack of legal documents across the reflective surface of the table. The bold heading on the top page read, "Voluntary Relinquishment of Corporate Assets and Comprehensive Medical Power of Attorney." Vincent stripped away his carefully cultivated mask of a grieving patriarch, revealing the desperate, ruthless man underneath. He tapped a manicured finger aggressively against the signature line, demanding my immediate compliance. He chillingly informed me that a specialized psychiatric transport vehicle was currently idling in the underground parking garage. The corrupted doctor sitting beside him had already finalized a fabricated, legally binding medical evaluation, diagnosing me with severe, uncontrollable paranoid delusions. Vincent explicitly stated that if I refused to sign away my inheritance voluntarily, they would immediately execute an involuntary psychiatric hold. They would legally drag me out of the building, strap me to a gurney, and commit me to a locked state mental health facility before the lunch hour. My mother sat perfectly still, casually sipping a cup of black espresso, entirely unfazed by the monstrous threat of institutionalizing her own daughter. My brother stood menacingly by the heavy double doors blocking the only exit. He flashed an arrogant, triumphant smirk, fully believing they had cornered me into absolute submission, completely unaware of the digital trap I had already sprung. They operated under the incredibly arrogant assumption that they controlled the narrative. They had absolutely no idea that Marshall had delivered the encrypted flash drive directly to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 48 hours prior. The seasoned federal prosecutors had quickly verified the authenticity of the offshore wire transfers and the digital communications with the Russian syndicate. A federal judge had subsequently authorized a comprehensive arrest warrant. However, Marshall had insisted the authorities wait for this exact moment. To secure a massive, airtight conviction for federal extortion and wire fraud, the prosecutors needed my family to commit the overt act of physically forcing a signature under extreme, documented duress. I looked down at the documents, my expression perfectly blank. I slowly picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting beside the paper. The tension in the boardroom spiked the air, growing suffocatingly thick as my father leaned forward in greedy anticipation. I locked eyes with the man who shared my DNA, offering him a hollow, freezing smile, and lowered the pen toward the paper. I never signed my name. Before the gold nib could even touch the pristine white parchment, the heavy solid wood doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open, shattering the heavy brass lock mechanism completely. The deafening sound echoed like a gunshot. Marshall marched into the room first, his posture radiating absolute authority. Right behind him was Gideon, followed by a heavily armed tactical squad of federal agents wearing tactical vests. The sheer speed and overwhelming force of the breach instantly paralyzed the room. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice booming with undeniable legal authority, cutting through the stunned silence. He formally announced the execution of a federal arrest warrant. The immediate physical transformation of my family was incredibly satisfying to witness. The arrogant, untouchable demeanor vanished in a mere fraction of a second. Vincent's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray as he stared in absolute horror at the badge flashed in his face. The espresso cup slipped from my mother's trembling fingers, shattering loudly against the polished hardwood floor, staining the expensive rug. Shane instinctively backed away, his hands raised in cowardly surrender, the false bravado completely obliterated by the sight of federal tactical gear. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around my father's wrists signaled the absolute destruction of their empire. The corrupted doctor frantically tried to distance himself, babbling desperate excuses, only to be forcefully spun around and cuffed against the mahogany wall by an agent. They were systematically read their Miranda rights, the repetitive legal phrasing echoing like a death knell over their grand conspiracy. I stood up slowly, stepping away from the table, watching the people who had conspired to destroy my life being forcefully dragged out of the room. The federal interrogation room was freezing, illuminated by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that offered absolutely no shadows to hide within. I sat at the stainless steel table across from the lead investigator. The final, earth-shattering twist of the entire conspiracy was not the forged medical records or the illicit financial ledgers. The ultimate piece of damning evidence had been provided directly by the victim himself. My grandfather had always possessed the sharp, intuitive instincts of a self-made corporate founder. He had silently anticipated the utter depths of his son's depravity. Long before his health began to fail, he had covertly hired a private security firm to install a microscopic motion-activated camera directly into the spine of a vintage leather encyclopedia resting on the top shelf of his personal study. The investigator turned a laptop screen toward me, pressing play on the recovered video file. The high-definition silent footage displayed my father sneaking into the dim study late at night. The camera captured his face with terrifying clarity. He moved methodically toward the desk, pulling the genuine bottle of prescribed beta blockers from the top drawer. With calculated precision, he dumped the life-saving medication into his pocket and refilled the container with visually identical over-the-counter vitamin supplements. He then pulled out his cell phone, visibly making a brief, urgent call to confirm the timeline with the Russian syndicate debt collectors. It was premeditated, cold-blooded sabotage. The horrifying act of manslaughter had been digitally preserved, completely destroying any potential legal defense, claiming natural causes or medical negligence. The swift hammer of the American judicial system fell with uncompromising severity. Because the crimes crossed multiple state lines and involved organized crime syndicates, the federal prosecutors relentlessly pursued maximum penalties. The localized corruption ring was completely dismantled. The bribed circuit court judge and the compromised psychiatric doctor were stripped of their respective licenses and immediately indicted on sweeping racketeering and federal conspiracy charges. My parents and my older brother were denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks due to their offshore banking connections. After a grueling, highly publicized trial, the federal judge handed down sentences that effectively ended their lives as free citizens. Vincent, Phyllis, and Shane each received consecutive sentences ranging from 25 to 35 years for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted extortion, and involuntary manslaughter. They were permanently transferred to separate maximum security federal penitentiaries with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The court simultaneously ordered the immediate asset forfeiture of their personal estates to partially restitute the massive debts they had accumulated. 6 long months later, I stood in the stark concrete visitor center of a federal correctional institution. I kept my arms tightly crossed over my chest, staring through the thick, bulletproof plexiglass partition. My mother sat on the other side wearing an oversized, drab institutional uniform. The luxurious arrogance she had displayed while sipping espresso during my attempted commitment had completely evaporated. She looked remarkably fragile, her face hollowed by the brutal reality of prison life. She picked up the heavy black receiver with trembling hands, weeping openly, using every ounce of emotional manipulation she had left. She desperately invoked the sacred concept of blood, crying about the inherent bond of family, begging me to use my vast corporate resources to fund an appellate defense or arrange for specialized commissary privileges. I picked up the corresponding receiver, holding the cold plastic against my ear. I did not blink. I stared directly into the desperate eyes of the woman who had happily handed me a glass of heavily sedated milk, intending to lock me inside a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. My voice was dead, devoid of any anger, sadness, or lingering familial affection. "I do not have a family," I stated simply. I slammed the heavy receiver back onto its metal cradle, cutting off her hysterical pleading mid-sentence. I turned my back on the glass partition and walked purposefully out of the bleak facility. I stepped into the waiting town car, idling outside, instructed the driver to take me back to the corporate headquarters, and permanently closed the door on the wreckage of my past. If you have stayed with me through this entire descent into family betrayal, I want to leave you with a crucial lesson I learned the hard way. Society constantly programs us to believe that blood is thicker than water, that familial bonds are inherently sacred and demand absolute loyalty. But the terrifying truth is that biological connection does not automatically guarantee safety or love. Sometimes the most dangerous predators you will ever face are the ones sitting directly across from you at the Thanksgiving table, armed with intimate knowledge of your vulnerabilities. My grandfather understood this. He loved his son, but he refused to be blinded by that love when the red flags appeared. He trusted his instincts over his heart, and that hypervigilance ultimately saved my life from beyond the grave. Do not ignore your intuition just because the threat wears a familiar face. Protecting your peace, your assets, and your sanity often requires setting impenetrable boundaries, even if it means walking away from the people who raised you. Sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation is recognizing when to stop fighting for a family that is actively fighting against you. What are your thoughts on this story? Would you have been able to walk away from the glass partition, or do you believe forgiveness is always required for blood relatives? Please share your perspective and personal experiences in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for listening, and remember to protect yourselves, even from those closest to you.